Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of Telos ontos Eidos. Hey in sync. How you going?
Yeah, I'm good. How about you?
Yeah, good, thanks. Today I want to talk about the requirements of a theory of everything. And I kind of wanted to start the conversation by kind of exploring a bit about what we need to assume in order to even start that journey of figuring out what the requirements of a theory of everything are. And I think there are some basic kind of assumptions or principles that I want to get clear first. For example, I feel like that you and I have similarities in our first principles of the principle of sufficient, the principle of sufficient reason.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah.
and I think that's assuming that we're trying to, um, you know, reason our way to an answer or an idea, then that's kind of unavoidable, right? Like even if you were to deny the sufficient reason, if you're using reason to do that, then you're evoking it. So yeah, it's a good starting point. And I guess from there, I think that one of the cautions I want to keep bringing in is whenever we make an assumption or add a new principle, are we also bringing in extra assumptions about the flavor or the outcome of the theory of everything? So, for example, if we were to bring in, say, falsifiability as a requirement for a theory of everything, what does that mean about what can be considered a theory of everything and what can't be considered a theory of everything? So, yeah, the exploration I want to have today is, and I've got this list of um, different things that might be considered in a theory of everything as requirements, taken from the Theory of Everything by Kurt Mungel's Discord, as a project that we used to be part of, where we were kind of exploring this stuff in a group. And yeah, I want to kind of go through a bit of that list and just explore if we were to include these different ideas as a requirement, what might the theory of everything be able to or not be able to look like.
Okay. Yeah, that sounds good.
Cool. The other thing I was considering is I've recently, semi-recently released an article about theories of everything and my exploration of theories of everything. And I kind of categorize two aspects: the grand unification theories, which are more about unifying the fundamental forces of physics, and what I call the theories of unified metaphysics, or TUM, which is the more like the ground of being, or the metaphysical nature of fundamental reality.
Yeah.
And I would like to think that a theory of everything somehow unites the two, like the theory of unified metaphysics gives something that grounds the grand unification theory in some way. Even if the TUM aspect of it isn't explicitly giving that, I think it should allow for that in some
Yes,
way.
yeah. No, I definitely agree with that. And in terms of um I like the distinction you've drawn because I think, physicists often talk about a theory of everything. They use that terminology when really what they're talking about is a grand unified theory of physics. And philosophers talking about using the same terminology often means something actually quite a bit more grand in its scope and implications. And that's what I would consider the true theory of everything is the kind of all encompassing unified theory of metaphysics, because that is supposed to be a complete encapsulation of not just physics but everything that there is to reality.
Right. So in the sense that when we talk about a theory of everything, we're defining its scope as not just a gut, but
Mhm.
something much grander. And I think in that sense, the requirement of a theory of everything takes on a very different lens, right? It's not just unites the fundamental forces of physics, but
Yeah.
provides many more answers. And I guess that's where we can get into some of these requirements. Or unless you had some more to
No,
reflect
no,
on.
no. That sounds good. Yeah.
Cool. So I guess the other lens I'm wanting to bring in with this is this sense that what, like, as part of the requirement, is it fair to ask that the theory of everything has to sort of provide a satisfiable answer or proof, or like kind of make sense in a way that explains things satisfying? Like, this is just meeting the principle of sufficient reason in some way, right? Like, it needs to be able to, sorry.
Yeah, I don't know. I heard two questions there, right? Like, so like a satisfying answer and then satisfying proof, right? So, and I would think of proof as being the kind of demonstration that excludes other options, right? So this and only this is the answer, and we kind of know, or we have a very good reason to think so.
Right.
Whereas a satisfying answer, it's plausible to think that you could come up with a satisfying answer and that someone else could come up with an alternative and equally satisfying answer. And then we might then have to consider the theories along other dimensions or criteria in order to determine which of them is superior.
Right. So maybe in the list of formulating requirements of a theory of everything, we need to in some way ensure that we, or do we, I guess is the question, need to ensure that in some way that we can, find a one true answer, or is it broad enough for multiple theories to possibly be the truth? And I think maybe this is where I am interested in the assumptions and the requirements that leads to one or the other. Mm-hmm. And if those aren't in there, then maybe the possible theory of everything that can meet those requirements is a lot more broad. So yeah, I'm interested in exploring that today.
It almost seems like you could think of like two sets of requirements, like one set of requirements which are like the baseline, like unless you meet these criteria, you're not a grand unified theory of metaphysics or a theory of everything. And then, the second set of criteria would be, evaluating the quality or the comparative position, I suppose, of how warranted each of the theories seems to be.
Yeah. But even something as simple as like Occam's razor or, parsimony is attempting to do that work in some ways, right? Like if assuming everything else is equal, then which one holds the least assumptions? Mm-hmm. And maybe there are other principles like that we might want to include that would also do that work for us.
Certainly, yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, I'd love to get to this. Unless you have anything more to say on that, I'd love to get to this list.
Yeah, let's get to it.
Cool. So yeah, the first thing I have on my list is explains physics. So this could be in some kind of simple and broad sense, I'm imagining. Like it's like it's not just kind of some abstract idea that is explained, is kind of like the analogy I'm imagining is like someone says, oh, look, here's this watch. It's a watch that can teleport you to different places. And they're like, oh, that's cool. How does it work? And you go, you put it on your wrist and you press the button. It's like, no, that's not how it works. That's just how do you use it? The how it works is, not explained. I think that when I say explains physics, I don't just mean like, oh, there's, in some idealism models, for example, they might say, oh, there's mind, and then mind generates reality, but without really explaining how that actually occurs. So when I think of it explains physics, I think of like the mechanisms or the relationship between what we understand as fundamental physics, like quantum mechanics or quantum field theories, and the proposed metaphysical substrate.
Okay. So this criteria explains physics. So I'm 1 foot in, 1 foot out on this one, So I think that it's reasonable to think that a good candidate theory for metaphysics can provide hints about what, by serving as a sort of a foundational context, right? It can provide hints that might So, for instance, when in quantum theory there are many competing theories, right? Interpretations, rather, many competing interpretations of quantum theory, and I think it's plausible to think that a good candidate theory would provide a clue as to which interpretation is more plausible, and in that way it could pave the way to an integrative understanding of physics. And also, of course, there's going to be certain things that in the physical framework, even in a unified physical framework, are going to be, as far as the physical theory is concerned, brute facts, right? And those are going to need an explanation. And in that way, I think that certainly we would tick this box, like in terms of explaining how come, for instance, there is a quantum field. If that's what it turns out, if it all comes down to a quantum field, right? The question will ultimately remain, how come there's a quantum field, And in that respect, yes, a metaphysical theory of everything must explain why there is whatever physics reduces to. Why is that the case, right? But I think this condition is often construed much more narrowly in the sense of giving us very specific indications about how physics works, which I think is just not what metaphysics is about exactly. Like it gives insight into physics, but it's not on the level of the precise details of the mechanics. It's more giving us a sense of what the general context of the mechanics is, which can help us to understand how they arise to begin with, or how they go together on a fundamental level, I suppose.
Okay, yeah. I can see how that's like one foot in, one foot out in some ways. Yeah, I imagine that if a metaphysics could in some way guide us towards choosing the correct unification theory, or like correct interpretation of quantum mechanics, that in some way, like if the assumption is that there's some kind of metaphysical substrate, there's something that is, a deeper level than whatever that quantum field is, or even the quantum field is kind of modeled as that substrate in some way. If the metaphysics can suggest that, then it should in some way be able to suggest why, and that why might, or I would imagine, could have the kind of details that I'm talking about in as well. Like I'm almost feeling like if the metaphysics suggests that level of clarification in that domain, that but doesn't go to the extent of explaining the kind of mechanics of it in any particular way, that it might just be incomplete, or it's like we can get more details or something like that.
I sympathize with what you're saying, but like my thought is that that's beyond the scope of metaphysics proper. And like that's like an implication of the theory, the unpacking of which would be the domain of the special science in question. Like when you're sort of saying, oh, so I'm like a physicist, and I'm partial to such and such a metaphysics, and this guides my intuitions, and so my investigation is sort of like this, and then you use that to discover that's just physics, right? That's not metaphysics anymore. And the job of unpacking those implications vis-a-vis any special science, I just see as not being part of the job of the metaphysical theory. All that should be implicit. The correct image should be implicit in the correct metaphysics, but it shouldn't specify the details. We have a field of knowledge for that, and it's called science.
Right. And I imagine that as a kind of requirements of the theory of everything, that includes the kind of gut and the tongue, that we might try and unite those in the best way possible. And if science has sort of found that in certain practices that are incompatible with metaphysics, for example, empiricism, then, which I don't think it like specifically has to be. I think that's just kind of like a modern day trope almost. We need to find, I think that we can find the uniting factor. Otherwise, I feel like we've got this gut and this tongue, and they're almost like two distinct substances with nothing.
Well, that's kind of, I'm a little bit confused by the last thing you said there, because for me, just it is the uniting factor, so to speak, like, and then the gut, whatever the gut is, it's like, the way I would think of it, it's like a puzzle, like a cognitive puzzle, but the answer is obvious, but you don't see it right away. You know what I mean? So implicit in the tum is going to be an obvious implication about the nature of physics that contextualizes the frameworks that we have in a cohesive and intuitive way. But it's so obvious that you can't see it. But once you see it, you're like, of course, like, and that's been my experience, at least working with my unifying framework of metaphysics, DM theory, is that, there's certain problems I'll approach, and I don't work out the problem from DM theory. That's not what I do. What I do is I try to work out the problem, and then at the end, if what I come up with, when I compare it to DM theory, it's like, duh, then I'm like, God, that's the answer then, because it's like, so independently I worked out the answer, but then when I look back at the metaphysics, it's like, if there had been a way to just peer into the metaphysics to see that part of the, what that answer was, that's what I would have seen. Because now that I've got the answer, it's obvious that that's exactly what I would find in there if I was able to navigate through that theory to the details that are implicit in it. You know what I mean?
Sure. Yeah. I think, like, specifically with DM theory, for example, you do suggest that you're leaving the kind of third step, which is the, unification with the gut almost, or the unfolding of physical reality open. And like, sort of in some of our conversations, you've suggested, block theory of time as one kind of element that you've so far explored, and kind of, oh yeah, that's what this looks like in regards to my theory. And I'm kind of curious to what your theory might look like with other, like, kind of jumping on other kinds of explanations and seeing how they fit. And maybe we should move on from this whole thing, but I think there's...
Well, just quickly, because I think I like this as it's a good first condition, I think, to examine. And I actually have something on my own list that kind of rhymes with it, so I wanted to offer it before we move on, which was, because I said I'm half foot in, half foot out, and I am. But the way that I would characterize this condition, the condition that I would impose, I suppose, is, that we expect a theory of everything, or a theory of unified metaphysics, to explain the world around us, both in terms of why it is in general, like, why is there something rather than nothing? I think that's the chief question that a metaphysics is supposed to give an answer to. But also in terms of how this specific world came to be, So, and that question is in part answered by special science like physics. But there's a part of that question that's answered by metaphysics, in the sense of that the area that's inaccessible to physics is the question of, well, why do the variables have the values that they do? Physics just treats that as a brute fact. It just that it just is the way it is. That's the nature of science, is to just accept the world as a given and kind of try and work out what's going on. But I think in that respect of giving us an answer, not just of why there is anything, but also why this world in particular should exist, and explaining physics in that respect, I would definitely impose that as a criteria that I would expect a theory of everything to meet.
Okay, so it's not so much the meeting place between the gut and the tum, like the very foundational kind of layers, but more like you use the analogy before of the puzzle pieces, the outside puzzle pieces, that gives a sense of a frame. And even, I think I'm imagining, or the way that I like to imagine the metaphysical frame, is that it's almost like every piece of the inside has a reflection of that outside. It's kind of like
that's a great way of, I'll have to think about that, actually, of a way to incorporate that aspect of the metaphor, because I think that's right. And there's also a sense in which, like, and I think this is underappreciated, but there's a sense in which if you do study the outline enough, like I was saying, you get clues about where pieces are supposed to go, which is different to how a normal puzzle works, where you don't get much information at all. But somehow you do get some information. But generally, as I was saying, the method that I prefer is to kind of try and fit them together on their own, and then to compare that to the edge to see, does this picture, like you would with a normal puzzle, does the picture look like it's making sense here? Is this where it goes? You know what I mean?
Yeah. So maybe just to round off this requirement of, the way I put it was explains physics. Maybe there's a broader version of that, which isn't specific mechanics of the grand unification theory. But then there's something about the metaphysics that does want to give us clues to a correct interpretation.
Mm-hmm. I think it's in what you said about the being reflected in the puzzle pieces. Like there's some fractal holographic thing going on where all the information is in every piece somehow. It's very strange, how that, but it is something like that.
I think our two models definitely fulfill, like we like that stuff, like fractals and whatever. Do you think there's any risks of bringing in the idea of a fractal into the requirements of a toe? Like, do you think
Good question.
Seems too much?
Yeah. So as a requirement, yes, it assumes too much, I think, actually. But as an analogy, which I think is the context in which it actually cropped up here, I think it's fine, because what I think we're trying to express there is a possible explanation for how you get those clues from the metaphysics. But that's not, I wouldn't specify that as a requirement that we would impose, like that I do think I generally, on a personal level, would regard a theory that meets that criteria as more important, but I wouldn't stipulate that as something that would be a common commitment I would expect of a theory of everything theorist rather.
Why not?
I think because it's conceivable that the nature of the world results in decoupling between different corners of reality, so we could just think about Descartes' demon, right? Like, we agree that no matter what, something in that situation is true, right? But if that situation were even if that's not the ultimate reality, even if, I don't know, like say there's like base reality and then there's a multiverse, and then in one of those multiverses people create universes, you're like living beings create more universes, and then one of those universes someone does Descartes' demon or something, you know what I mean? Oh damn, what?
Like I imagine that in that scenario there has to be some point where the created universe is just completely not like the universe that it sits in, right? Like
exactly.
It has to be
Yes, thank you for that.
simulated in some specific way that the people in that universe just cannot
exactly
fathom.
So, and we could be there, so it's conceivable that stipulation of fractality doesn't hold all the way through, but I'm personally dubious about that. But I can see how someone else would potentially not want to impose that a requirement.
Maybe there are other requirements that we might get to that make that distinction more clear. Like, for example, in a universe where there are these other universes being created that not by beings necessarily, but just by like in some particular way, that are just so not like the thing that is creating that universe. There might be some questions that we can ask about that, like be skeptical about that idea that leads to another criteria that we can bring in, like parsimony, for example, or like...
Yes. No, I agree. And I think that intuition seems right, that it seems to me that if we did interrogate that possibility more carefully, there would be constraints and limitations that would hint towards another criteria that we intuitively already assert.
Cool. My next thing on the list is explains mathematics, but I feel almost like that the explains physics, explains mathematics, we're sort of reducing in some way to explains patterns, or explains like specifically something scale invariant as kind of the patterns that persist throughout existence. And again, that sort of fits with that fractal thing, but I I think no matter whether we call it a fractal or whatever, it's a pattern that exists like in nature and in various different ways in nature that we can.
I mean, I think of what you're tagging with mathematics there. I think of under the title logic with a capital L, which I would think of as the objective regularities inherent in nature itself, and I think that explains those regularities. So in the same sense as I said in relation to physics, where there are the regularities derive in our scientific models from certain physical, like all the special sciences ultimately reduced to physics, and physics is dependent on these certain factors that could have been other than they are, and in that sense we're going to want to find an explanation for the regularities which are contingent in terms of metaphysics. But I'm skeptical as to the capacity of metaphysics to provide an explanation for regularities in general, because it is an implicit commitment of any project of explanation that there are such regularities, and so there's no way to vindicate that commitment because it's implicitly assumed. You can't not assume it, so the vindication falls through. It doesn't,
Right. Like if you were to explain like irrationality as the foundation, then you're not explaining anything.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay. I feel like the regularity and patterns in terms of, I like that you brought in your capital L logic, because that helps me understand how you think about that in a different way. And it's interesting to think, like if we're bringing in the principle of sufficient reason to start with, then that's almost capturing that as well. It's like, well, exactly. We're assuming there's regularities that we can explain or capture within our conceptual apparatus.
And that actually, I think those two, so that second part of the like regularity thing, the general part, oh fuck it, what was the other thing you said? I hate ADHD.
About the principle of sufficient reason? No.
Yes, yeah. And the principle of sufficient reason, both of those I think of as pre-reflective commitments. Like, they are constitutive of the project of reasoning. They're not optional. So those aren't even requirements of a TOE. Those are requirements of sense making in general. You cannot make any sense unless you accept principles such as the principle of sufficient reason and the notion that there are regularities in the world.
It's interesting, though, that people can still use those tools to come to conclusions, that there is no rational explanation for things.
Yeah, I mean, the beauty of what it is to be a subjective creature is that you can be wrong. You can be wildly, wildly wrong.
Okay, well, my next criteria from the list is a unified understanding of forces, which I think is more just like the gut. So I'm not sure if that's, I don't think well, if we're talking about true theory of everything, I guess the gut is a part of that in some sense.
Can I just noticed something. I want to know if it's intentional.
Yeah.
Gut and tum.
That's totally intentional.
That's so cool.
I'm glad you saw it. I was thinking it was obvious, but
no, I'm a bit daft.
Yeah, just two aspects of the same thing.
Yeah, no, that's very cool. Yeah.
Anyway, so the next, I got a couple of things here actually that maybe is more on the gut side than the tum side, which is
just maybe list them out in a row.
Yeah. So so there was explains physics, explains mathematics, explains unified understanding of forces, which I think is probably the definition of the gut in some sense. So explains matter, and explains causality, and explains complexity and emergence.
All right. Explains matter. I'm not even quite sure what that means.
Yeah, well, because matter is such a, occult or esoteric sort of truth in some sense. Like it's always assumed that we know what we're talking about when we talk about matter. And, like the goalposts of physicalism keep moving further and further back. And the idea that space-time is emergent, but the universe is still a physical space and that matter is primary, just sort of the meaning of that has lost a lot of sense.
Yeah.
So explains matter as, I guess...
I mean, when I think of matter, I'm like,
Yeah.
this is matter. Stuff I
Yeah,
can
yeah.
do with my hand and it doesn't go through. That's matter, and it's
Yeah.
like, in general, I guess, the stuff that things are made of, right?
Right. So maybe explains space-time might be
Yeah.
a catch-all term.
That seems like a more adequate charge, I suppose, because as far as matter is given an explanation, I think it's explained in terms of physical forces, right? Like, what we experience as matter, what we call matter, is like the outcome of the interactions of these forces or something like that.
Right. Like mass and charge and whatnot.
Exactly. So yeah, explains space-time. That seems like a reasonable... I would expect a theory of everything to explain space-time. And more generally, I see that as being a more specific version of the first stipulation, explains physics. That's really what we're expecting it to explain. That's what I'm talking about when I say the fundamental constants, because insofar as space-time is emergent, what that means is that there's these certain things we trace it back to, that it emerges from. Those, strictly speaking, are space-time, whatever those constants are,
Right. Yeah. Cool. Well, how about complexity and emergence?
Yeah, no, that's an interesting one. Complexity.
Because I
So,
always feel... Oh, go on.
no.
Oh, I feel like the kind of where we got to with our first criteria in terms of like fundamental patterns, there's a sense that those patterns are self-similar but also recursive, or somehow like they're not the exact same as they're scale invariant, so they're found everywhere, but on those different scales they're not the same outcome of that pattern. It's kind of like an archetype of the sovereign, like, it can look like an ancient Egyptian pharaoh, or it can look like a medieval king, and it's sort of this, the pattern exists in these different scales, but looks different. And I think that complexity and that's kind of how I think of complexity and emergence.
I totally agree. That really rhymes with my understanding, but I wouldn't consider it to be in the domain of metaphysics. I see that as being... it's not any specific special science. Instead, it is something like, I don't know, a philosophy of science, integrative kind of conception. Like, the notion of hierarchies, different levels to reality, I think is a conceptual tool that is helpful in understanding how the different fields of science fit together, I suppose. But the working out of the details of that, I mean, a metaphysician or a metaphysicist could do that work. There's nothing improper about it, but I wouldn't necessarily expect that. I would think that a supposition, again, like on a personal level, when it comes to evaluating a good metaphysical theory, I would make the supposition that the theory is going to have this fractal sort of recursive quality to it. And so I wouldn't expect the theory to have to specify. Okay, yeah, I wouldn't expect the theory to have to specify how complexity, because like it just seems like it makes sense in the way of, like, when you get these self-same principles like interacting in aggregate, like the manifestations of that interacting in aggregate, you get these the emergence of this new behavior, but that is fundamentally in principle the same underlying mechanics, but like the complexification arises out of the interaction of the aggregate somehow,
Yeah, well, I think maybe somehow is something that we can poke at and try and like scratch the surface a bit there. Like if there is a pattern that's like, okay, let's say we've kind of got this fractal pattern of self-similarity.
Yeah.
And then from that self-similarity, there's also this pattern of complexity and kind of like multiple things coming together that are self-similar but different. Fusing and becoming in like a whole on is like the or intellectually like a greater than some of its parts. And that thing is its own thing, and that can also merge with other versions of that. Like that process feels like a metaphysical fundamental process, possibly. Like the pattern of that occurring could be considered something inherent in the outline of the puzzle in some way.
Yes. I mean, immediately my thought is that that's going to be a more natural conception for someone who takes a process view of reality in general. So, and I guess, to offer a contrasting conception, like for me, so when I think of like DM theory and how this sort of self-similar sort of complexification happens, so I think of very general principles that remain true at every level, like the PSR, like the law of identity, the law of non-contradiction, this kind of thing. And then I see that as, I suppose, inherently entailing like a set of different things that are like the result of the interplay of these principles. And those I would see as like possible worlds. And then what possible worlds are, it's like all these different configurations of different ways things could be, and then and so already what we have is so we start with principles that, and when we get to a possible world, all these principles, the PSR, the laws of logic, I see those as being inherent to all of those possible worlds, sort of part of the constitution. But then there's, in addition, contingent facts, which are like fusions of these fundamental principles, into random identities, say, that define the nature of that world. We would call these physical constants of our world, and within that, then you get sort of a baseline for, so in our universe, it's space-time, and that allows this aggregation, right? But the complexification is already going on in the metaphysical derivation, because you start with something general, right? And simples, really, general simples, which are the principles. And then the interweaving of these, that is, from my way of thinking about it, always, it's not like a process thing, right? It just, they always are interwoven. But you can see how that step up, I have no way but to I have no option but to have recourse to temporal language, but I'm trying to, but in that step up from the fundamental to the contingent, to the individual universes or the possible worlds or whatever, you can see complexification is already there, just in the fact that you now have different things, right? Different worlds. That's already complexification. And then that process continues as you get the interweaving then of the physical constants, which gives us physical particles, and then the interweaving of those gives us chemistry, and then the interweaving of that gives us biology. And so that criteria, although I do think obviously there's some implicit sense of, like a metaphysics should answer to the arising of complexity. And I guess kind of what I'm saying is, for me on a personal level, although again, I wouldn't stipulate that you have to have this fractality, but if you have this fractality, then you've got a ready-made answer, I think, to the question of complexity. Obviously, the specifics are going to be different on someone else's account, and we might regard how satisfactory that is as a reflection of the adequacy of their solution. But I think the general outline, in the sense of, well, these general simples, just they go together, and then complexity arises because the simples are always true at every level, right? That's the fractality, the thing that makes, that's how, I always think of that as an answer to the problem of epistemic access when it comes to metaphysics, because we don't have empirical access, but at the same time, it's like, whatever is true on the most fundamental level is true everywhere, is so true that it can't fail to be true. So it's like there's nowhere it's not. That information is so everywhere because it's the most fundamental constituent of the universe, of everything that is, So, yeah, I guess. I know I rambled a bit there, but that's
okay. I think maybe something coming up for me is the sense that within DM theory, similar to the thing we were saying about Descartes' demon, like there might be a scratching on the surface there that is like why multiple worlds and not just one? Like because there's like in your theory you don't get explicit about how your fundamental laws produce a particular world. It's kind of like they're there because all possible formulations of those
precisely because they don't produce any particular world, or that there's no reason that I can see for the narrowing down to a particular world that I think.
But I think that job, that work of narrowing down to a particular world is, that's a simulation issue, right? Like that we don't have a simulation of those laws to get to any particular world.
So that's one way of looking at it, but no, like my perspective that comes to me from DM theory is that there is no narrowing down, basically, and that seems to me like a more graceful solution or answer to the puzzle. So the puzzle is, why does this particular world exist? But that question rests on the supposition that this particular world is the only one. And that's an intuitive thought because this is the only one we have access to. But in truth, we don't know. There could be other worlds. So since that's not ruled out on an epistemic level, and since I can see no way to rule it out on a metaphysical level, so someone could propose what I call sometimes the derivation of specificity. They could propose a mechanism for that does narrow down. But my thought is that surely it works without needing to narrow it down by just stipulating that this world is not more actual than any other, and the reason that we call this world actual is because this is the one that we are in.
Yep, no, I can understand your reasoning around that. And I don't want to get into too much of a detail scratching around that, but maybe that's a good thing for another time. I have another conversation about DM theory for sure.
Absolutely, yeah.
But I'll try and backtrack a bit to the kind of criteria that we're trying to establish here.
Sorry, I got a little bit.
It's all good. No, I understand that. I think the thing that I said was that if we've got one criteria, that is that the sense that the edge puzzle pieces give us patterns that should exist throughout. Like if that's a criteria, then I guess the question then becomes, is it just one pattern, or is there multiple patterns, or is there different kinds of similarities between the edge and the pieces? We've already kind of talked about this sort of archetypal or self-similarity pattern. Maybe there's a dialectical pattern of the dance of opposites, and that kind of seems prevalent through reality. Yeah. Maybe there are other kinds of patterns that we can say exist in the metaphysics.
Great question. And I think one way of looking at this question is as examining whether emergent mechanics backwards propagate or something like that. Because one way of thinking about it is, chemical kind of dynamics kind of only arise once you have chemicals. And so, you could think of, there's many patterns, but they're all kind of, they only propagate up the chain, right? So physics has an influence on everything, chemical, biological, etc. Whereas, biological only has an influence on physiology, psychology, not on chemistry, right? Another way of looking at it, and way that maybe is more akin to, say, an alchemical frame of mind, is to think that in line with this idea of fractality, right? The idea that patterns that emerge, that manifest in one aspect or dimension of the world, are echoed even in more primitive dimensions, which, in a scientific frame of mind, are upstream from the effect that we're talking about.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think there And I think there are still some patterns which are sort of scale agnostic, like, or scale invariant, such as the fact that the complexity emerges, not the thing that emerges from the complexity, but just the fact of complexity, if assuming that is a fact. Which, I don't know, I kind of feel like that could be explained in some kind of metaphysical sense, like a fundamental pattern of some kind, but I don't want to get into the specifics here necessarily. And I also still want to be cautious about, proposing something that assumes a particular metaphysics. So
I think with respect to the criteria of complexity, I think it is a reasonable expectation to impose upon a theory of everything that it should give a sense for how complexity arises from simplicity, because that is the observed way that our world is. And one of the criteria that I think makes sense, you don't have to have the metaphysics explain why the world has to be that way, right? As in, like, all worlds would be or whatever, or it's somehow metaphysically necessary. But you do have to explain why the world is the way that it is.
Yeah.
And complexity is a part of that, for sure.
Yeah, cool. Yeah, I think we agree there. Anything more to add, or shall I move on to our next?
Let's move on to that.
Cool.
Yeah.
So next, I think this one's related to causality, which explains free will or the not of free will. Because I really think that in order to have free will of any kind, we have to assume that there's some kind of capacity to sort of step out of the causal chain and make decisions. And it does. I'm kind of partial to compatibilism, where there's deterministic causal chain, and in some sense, our capacity to be mindful and to not be, completely taken by our base impulses and our, the prefrontal cortex is kind of like this emergent property of of reality in some sense that gives us capacities that, when we usually think of causality, it's changed slightly. That's my assumption about it. But anyway, I'm curious to hear about that as a criteria for the theory of everything.
I mean, I have a similar feeling about the debate as you do. And I think the solution is a kind of compatibilism that I think, as you alluded to, involves giving some new sense to the term free will that focuses more on our capacity to reflectively reevaluate our life pattern. And then if we decide we're dissatisfied with, like, how we've lived up until now, to forge a new way of being. I think that conception plausibly sets us apart from animals. We seem to be the only creature who proactively redesigns our way of being in the world all the time. But as to the relevance of it to a metaphysics, so not that puzzle or debate or problem in particular, I don't think is strictly relevant to metaphysics, or shouldn't be given. There's no reason to think metaphysics would necessarily give you the solution. I think, obviously, as in the other situation, it will give hints, but I do think that this points towards an expectation that is a reasonable expectation to have of a metaphysics or a theory of everything, which is it should resolve puzzles within our current paradigms. So this is an example of a puzzle. It might not resolve this puzzle in particular, but one of the ways that we test the adequacy of solutions is by seeing to what degree they're able to help us to resolve puzzles that are prevalent within our existing paradigm.
I really like that, actually. I think that the generalizing out of this criteria to solving puzzles is nice, because it almost gives this competitive sense between theories, like who can solve the most puzzles.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I like that a lot, as well as meeting other criteria. Because I always put free will debates in the domain of ontology, because I think that whatever is assumed there is going to have a big impact on how things can be, whether it's indeterminism or determinism or whatever. It's all about assumptions on ontological grounds.
Yeah, I think the reason I would maybe create some distance between that and an ontological discussion is because I think that the debate about free will in reality is about the definition of the term free will, which has not so much to do with ontology, I think, as to do with the misrepresentation of what people mean by the concept, kind of a linguistic unpacking that philosophers have done historically that I think is not. It's like it captures a good, prominent sense of what people mean, but that sense, I think, is only a way of pointing towards what the concept is actually about. It's not actually the literal definition. It just looks like it is.
This definitely feels like a discussion for another time. I have questions.
Yeah.
But I'll move on to some more of these. So now the next one I have is explain symmetry and symmetry breaking.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah, which I think, again, for me, this idea of symmetry in the universe alludes to a dialectic again, like this sense that there's this balance, and then from the balance, there's also this antithesis of balance, which is
like a polarity and a balance between the polarity.
Yeah, and that sort of maybe fits in with that puzzle piece as a symmetry and symmetry breaking is a reflection of that cyclical or dialectical process.
Yeah,
or something.
I would think of, symmetry I think of as like a byproduct of the fractality of reality, I suppose. Fractality, I don't know. And symmetry breaking I think of as being tied up with the emergence of complexity, actually. I think symmetry breaking is what you see whenever complexity emerges.
Cool. Do you consider, and again, this might be a discussion for another time, but entropy and complexity as kind of these opposing forces? Some people like to.
I don't know. I think I'm not confident in my grasp on the concept of entropy. It is quite a subtle notion, I think. And I've seen multiple different in unpackings of it. And because it's a concept that's essentially based on a thermodynamic, principle, I don't feel like I have a strong enough grasp of thermodynamics to know what unpacking is the correct one. So I'm not sure.
Okay, maybe we can move on from that one then. I don't know if we've. I feel like the way that I'm understanding symmetry and symmetry breaking is coming back to these, these sort of fractal or finding the patterns.
Yeah, me too. Yeah,
nature. Okay, so here's one. It says has or hints at mechanisms for consciousness.
Hints at. I'm happy to grant hints at.
I guess
has, I'm much more reticent to give has.
Well, this one feels like maybe it fits the puzzle solving element. Like we've got this puzzle of consciousness.
Yes.
And if it can explain that, then that's great.
Well, yeah, I would that I agree with that characterization, and I would say this is like a mega puzzle. This is like one of the golden puzzles. You solve this, your theory is much more attractive.
I think it'd be interesting to consider, if a theory solves consciousness or has some satisfiable explanation to like a mega puzzle, but then is also, doing something else that seems less parsimonious in order to do that. Like, how do we balance out?
Great question. Yeah.
Yeah, like, curious to hear your thoughts on that.
I guess my thought would usually be, once a new solution to a mega problem is proposed, it's not usually the most efficient or articulate. So usually what it is when people get the correct answer, the correct answer is usually in the gist somewhere, but it's not usually pinpointed correctly, or pinpointed at all. And so, yeah, I guess. I lost my train of thought. Can you refresh?
Yeah. Well, I was thinking about how Whitehead, for example, has his actual occasions, and there's a sense that because actual occasions are doing the thing that we can say consciousness is doing, it's kind of like an answer to consciousness, or like it's like consciousness is baked in, but it's also not really explaining conscious. Oh, I mean, it's reframing consciousness as opposed to something which, is that a satisfying, like just the fact that a model
the
like
question of whether it's satisfying ultimately is going to depend on the individual, right? So
sure.
I might not find it satisfying, you might, our reader might, our listener might not, So, is it an explanation? It depends on the details, I guess. I'm inclined to say no, but I'm not willing to rule it out. I suppose. I mean, I see parsimony as being, one of those. I think it's the most important epistemic virtue or theoretical virtue when it comes to a theory of everything. So, what I would say is, if it solves a problem well, then there's probably a simpler way of solving the same problem well that's similar and that we hadn't thought of, that will then be a development of the same line of thinking, is basically my thought.
Yeah, I like that. Is there any set of requirements in there that kind of frame that idea? Like that sense that, the puzzle, like, oh, you've attempted this solution to the grand puzzle. However, this is missing, or like, I guess that depends on the requirements that we're setting.
Yeah, I think I would just enshrine it by saying parsimony is the most important virtue. So if you've got a solution to a puzzle, but you've had to introduce like unnecessary or unjustified assumptions to make it work, then that points to the flaw. There's a flaw, obviously, in that respect, and it's an important flaw. And I would say that, like, I mean, unless it solved all the puzzles, that would be the only way I'd be willing to accept an unparsimonious solution, right? So if even 10% of the puzzles are not solved, then my commitment to parsimony tells me that whatever the solution is that includes the rest of the puzzles is going to be simpler than whatever I've got now, basically.
Right. Yes, and I think the criteria of parsimony is interesting because for me, it kind of has to be integrated with a bunch of other criteria, like not taken on its own. I wouldn't put it on a pedestal as like the most important or anything like that.
It can't be put on its own. I agree. Like you can't. It definitely has to be combined with other criteria. There's no question. You can't have something that's just parsimonious. I mean,
yeah.
But what I'm saying is, when comparing, like if we're comparing specifically the puzzle solving question virtue, right, versus parsimony, what I'm saying is that my commitment to parsimony is much stronger, I suppose, and that unless like there was no puzzles left over, that would be enough for me to say, okay, maybe parsimony's not right. Maybe that's not the right way of going about this. Maybe it's not as valuable a principle as I thought.
Yeah.
But if there are puzzles left over, experience has taught me that the solution that has, like my current solution is inadequate, obviously, because it doesn't include all the puzzles. And so whatever the upgraded version of this, because this is clearly mostly right? Whatever the refined version of this is probably going to be more elegant. Correct answers are usually elegant. So, and so that commitment is really strong because I've learned from a long experience that correct answers tend to be elegant,
Yep. Is that one of our criteria then, elegance?
Well, I think that is parsimony. That is, yeah.
Yeah, whenever I think of parsimony, because I've had people debate with parsimony as kind of the primary factor, whenever I think of parsimony, I always like to emphasize that the part of it that is all things being equal, the one with simplest assumptions. And, what do we mean by all things being equal? Like if they, just because it's parsimonious, if it doesn't explain shit, then it's
good. Exactly. So, and this is the thing. So parsimony is one of those virtues I'd put up on a pedestal, as you say, and right next to it on the same level on a pedestal, I would also put up explanatory scope or adequacy. Okay. Yep. And that's what's being thought to be equal when we're comparing explanations for explanations to be equal, they have to explain the same number of things and they have to explain them as well as one another, and in that situation, I would say 100% of the time, the more parsimonious answer is the better answer. When they have equal scope and they equally answer. The quality of the answers is they're equally coherent, equally clear, which is obviously an idealized situation. You never really get that, but it's helpful, I think, to get that sense of, I think those two criteria of parsimony and explanatory adequacy or scope, those I would put on pedestals. Those are the most important things.
Yeah, it's interesting that when I think of an explanation, I like to distinguish between explanation and description, because quite often people think that a description is an explanation. So, for example, if you say, what is time? And you say, oh, it's what we measure when a clock hand moves. That's more like a description of some mechanisms.
Yep.
So when I think of explanatory scope, I also like to think of kind of mechanisms, like how much of this explanation is sort of tied together in terms of, almost like causality, or like this thing happens and this thing happens and this thing happens.
So how systematic the conception of the mechanics is.
Yeah, exactly. Because I think it's strange to say something like, or maybe it's just unsatisfactory to me in some way to say like, oh, because of these rules, this occurs, without showing how that happens. Like it's like there's a missing piece to me of like.
Yes. So, and actually what you're talking about is the dissatisfaction is rooted in your intuitive sense of the fact that that's not, as you're saying, an explanation. What explanation? There's a great book called Necessary Existence by Alexander Proust.
Yeah, I started reading it.
Yeah, great, really interesting. And part of the way he defines what an explanation is, and I love this because this really gets at the sense of it. It's one of the reasons that I explain in some of the talks that for me the PSR is the seed intuition of reason, of explanation, but explanations work by dispelling mystery. If there's mystery, then the explanation wasn't complete, as a general rule,
Yeah.
And that's how you know the difference between a description and an explanation is an explanation makes you feel like there's nothing left to ask, whereas a description leaves things out.
Cool. Yeah. So when we think of explanatory scope, we're kind of emphasizing explains.
Eliminate the mysteries that are inherent in making sense of the world.
Cool. Yeah, I love that. Cool. I'll just move on to the next one because it's actually related to consciousness, which is explains qualia or internality.
Yeah. I'm torn on this one. Because I think that's a bit different to explains consciousness, which I think is a contingent and specific phenomenon. But internality, like how is internality possible? I don't think it's part of the job of metaphysics to answer that question, but I'd like an answer wherever it comes from.
It's another puzzle, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. It's another puzzle, and it's on an equal. It's not quite the same as the puzzle of the nature and mechanics of consciousness, but it's very similar in terms of the prestige of how big of a problem it is.
Yeah. I kind of wanted to get into maybe your definitions or differentiation between internality and consciousness, because when I think of consciousness, I usually think of phenomenal consciousness, like Chalmers, what it's like to be. And that gives a sense, like what it's like to be gives a sense of being on the inside of something and having an experience.
Yes. I mean, internality I would associate with awareness. Awareness I think of as the primitive of consciousness. I think things are aware that we wouldn't normally consider conscious per se. Plants, for example, are they conscious? They're certainly aware. They are responsive to changes in their environment. They respond dynamically. They're definitely processing what's going on. So, but because I understand consciousness, like seems to mark out a more sophisticated phenomenon than just awareness. That's why we don't say trees and stuff are conscious. It's because consciousness is associated with all these other more complex and sophisticated behaviors that I like. So when I think of consciousness, I think of, I suppose, mental experience of animals primarily, and especially of human beings. And I think this is the confusing thing, is consciousness like labels a whole bunch of things, but like the biggest portion of the consciousness concept is what consciousness is for humans. And what consciousness is for humans is quite different from awareness or internality. It's this notion of self-awareness, right? Recursive, linguistic, self-referential articulation and knowledge and insight, and something over and above merely having internality. Consciousness, I think, has all these connotations of language use and of sophisticated capacity for representing yourself to yourself, which I don't necessarily associate with awareness or with internality as a primitive.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, I think maybe that's where some of the debates on consciousness go awry, is because people have these different uses of the word. Like I was saying, the putting consciousness as pure experience is kind of putting it as internality, as the way you put it. And that leads to this idea that it can go all the way down in some way.
Yes.
But I agree. I like the discussion, because I think, consciousness is a sort of overused and misunderstood word, that it's maybe good to get more clear on what we're talking about. And like some of the things I heard you talking about is like metacognition, or different faculties that allow us to do different things. But then there's like the mirror test, like do animals recognize themselves as mirrors, has been like a staple for whether they've got consciousness or not.
Yeah. And in terms of consciousness, I would say the biggest, the principal pivotal factor that distinguishes consciousness from awareness or internality is the self-referential nature of it. So consciousness comes online when you start to become aware of yourself as a being, as a living creature. When you start to represent yourself to yourself, that's when you become conscious.
Okay. Oh, and you think that's a uniquely human trait?
No, that's not uniquely human, no. Yeah. But there are a bunch of other higher order faculties that come online after that, associated with and birthed from that we don't observe in animals. And that's why I said it's not that consciousness just means what humans have, but the biggest part of the concept of consciousness relates to what humans have.
Cool. So in terms of explains consciousness or explains internality, how do you think they're related? Because they seem related, right? Like they're
definitely related, yeah.
Consciousness sort of, it requires internality.
Yeah, I think, yes. And so that's why I'm more torn. Whereas with consciousness, I was willing to say, that seems to me a details thing, like internality, I think, is more open to the question of, does it go all the way down? I don't know. And so I'm not sure. I wouldn't personally impose it as a requirement on a TOE, but let's put it in a maybe box, right? Because potentially, I guess, and I think this applies maybe to a lot of the puzzle solving ones, right? It's not that that's a requirement I would impose, but giving an answer to that as part of your theory of everything makes your theory more attractive by a long shot. So I wouldn't necessarily say, unless your theory does this, it's not good enough, but it is a criteria in the sense of, if let's say on all the central criteria, we do have two actually equal hypotheses, then the puzzle solving starts to matter a lot more.
Yeah, I can agree with that. Yeah, it's definitely the sense that the more of these we put as sort of requirements, then the more broad a theory of everything becomes. Like our definition of a theory of everything becomes huge. And it's like it literally has to explain everything.
And I generally want to avoid encroaching on the special sciences. Yeah. Because I think they do that job fine, and that and that, like I was saying, like I think to the degree that TOE sort of the implications of a TOE get unpacked into the details of physics, that's done by a specialist, and it's just them doing their science. So that's for me a really good justification for cutting it off in terms of what we expect it to specify, because whatever's implicit, for me, the kind of things that other people might want to be specified, I think of as implicit and unpackable by the relevant expert, I guess.
Assuming they're not a specialist or something. Well, I guess I have a sense of a disagreement here around, for example, in my psychology or psychotherapy, to be more accurate, education, there's a big emphasis on ontology, and the one's ontology and like the assumptions of how reality works impacts the assumptions on what a human being is and what are they capable of, and that impacts how to treat them as in terms of psychology. And all these different paradigms emerge from different ontological assumptions, like behaviorism emerges from materialism, and Jung's more mystical quality of his model emerges from different possible ontologies. But I definitely feel like that there is a link between the special sciences and metaphysics that underpins these assumptions, if you're wanting to put those together. And if we're going to talk about like, what's the ideal psychology, if there was one, then we have to think about, well, whatever the ideal psychology is whatever would help a human being the best, and we have to know what a human being is, and in order to do that, we have to have like the explanations around what is possible for a human being. Like, for example, if we were to take a particular metaphysics where there's some kind of shamanic realm, or like there's spirits and entities and things, then people would assume that in order to treat a human best, we have to converse with the entities and appease them, or like the that's a little bit of a tried example maybe, but I do think it has an impact on the special sciences in various different ways, maybe more like humanities. But
because you articulated that as a disagreement, what was it that you would contrast that in? What
I guess you were saying that we should leave the job of
no, but you are a psychological, like you're a practitioner in psychology, so you saying, well, I would want to apply that. That's exactly what I'm talking about.
Right, I got it. So, like, don't try and explain an area that you have no understanding of. Is that
exactly? Just if the theory's right, it'll give the experts what they need to guide their research in the right direction.
Okay.
But there's no requirement of the theory itself to do that work, which, properly speaking, belongs to the sciences, basically.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think I have an assumption that in order to even conceive of the theory of everything, you have to be a kind of polymath in some sense. Like, you have to have an interest in all these different fields. And sure, there's going to be like, unless you're an absolute genius, there's going to be gaps in your knowledge. But I think you're right. Like wherever the gaps are, you leave that or try and get an expert on board, or try and like, I'm going to look at this particular person's, articulation of this and try and match my theory to that.
Yeah. I mean, you don't even necessarily have to get an expert on board yourself. One thing you could do if you happen to create something you think is a correct theory of everything is you just publicize it with the thought that, if it's out there in the public consciousness, then people just will, if it's correct, then people will end up thinking it's correct probably, and then it'll inform their investigations and so on. So,
yep. Cool. Okay, well, should we move on?
Yeah.
So I have a couple here that I think are maybe related, so I'll read them all out. I've got mythos friendly and commensurate with spirituality. And this third one I'm not sure if I want to keep in, but explains various psyche phenomena.
Like psychic phenomena? Or...
No, psyche, like like explains dreams or explains like us the symbolic nature of our storytelling capacity or whatever various different.
What was the second thing?
So it's mythos friendly, commensurate with spirituality, which I think is kind of like, again, the mythos friendly element.
Oh yeah, they seem like the same. Yeah, kind of.
Yeah.
Just at the same coin kind of thing. Not a requirement.
Yeah.
Like certainly something that I personally would look for, as an individual. But like, there's no theoretical necessity that it. And also, I feel like this notion of spirituality friendly, that's pretty subjective. Like, human
Who's
beings are
spiritual?
very adaptable. You could probably make anything spirituality friendly if you try hard enough. Just
Yeah.
spiritualizing something and adding sort of more meaning-oriented ideas as extrapolations of some, theoretical understanding of the world. That doesn't seem.
Yeah.
I'm having trouble imagining a framework that would be spirituality unfriendly. Because even atheism is spirituality friendly if you try.
Sure. Yeah, I'm imagining or interpreting. I'm interpreting. Fuck, I got that stuck in my head now. I can't unthink it. I'm interpreting this as meaning something similar to mythos friendly, which to me means something like from the one logos can come many mythos, and that maybe the mythos that we do find in our current history and even the kind of hero's journey and the things that we're most attracted to in terms of storytelling and the different kind of archetypes, they're somehow explained at least in that kind of general pattern level.
Okay.
Like archetypes would be explained, for example, like why are there.
There seem like separate commitments that you and I share, but that an average theoretician might not, though, right? Like I certainly agree. Like again, on a personal level, like I would be looking for the theory to accommodate my other commitments, right? Including, archetypes and other sort of universal patterns like that. But I can't see that. That seems more to do with what I think the world is like than which is not a shared. That's not shared, so I can't reasonably expect other people to. It doesn't make sense to impose upon someone else to explain why the world is a certain way if they don't think it is that way. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I guess that's why the explains various phenomena of the psyche is a kind of
it's vague,
vague enough to kind of catch
the
differences between.
Yes, we're in the vague form. Then I'm happy to agree to. Yes, we should that's another one of the things of yes, we're going to expect it to give us a sense of why things are the way they are. I guess it's just that could turn out to be very trivial depending on how narrowly someone construes the scope of what those phenomena are.
Yeah. See, I again, this is like my biases, but I like to think of it as that our minds and our everything, even if it's emergent, is still made of the fundamental stuff. It's not emergence doesn't mean something.
No, I agree with that.
Separate.
Yeah.
And that in that sense, that whatever our experiences are of psyche and mind are in some reflection of fundamental stuff, they're not just completely separate domains in some way.
Yeah.
So
that's what I meant when I said, I would, on a personal level, I would want it to, because I share those commitments about the nature of the psyche and also the fractality. This is basically what we're discussing is the fusion between those two commitments of what the world is like, including certain phenomena such as archetypes and also this fractality notion. But those aren't expectations I would impose on someone else about the world.
But there's an interesting thing. I wrote an article recently about this as the isomorphisms of reality. I think that because in order to have a sense that we can know what the fundamental stuff is, we have to assume that our minds are as such that it's like a relatable foundation, right? Like that.
Yes.
My mind it's created in a way that I can
Yes.
I can touch it in some particular way, even if what I say out of my mouth is just like a symbolic form. There's some like fundamental connection between how the world is fundamentally and how my mind is fundamentally, and like I don't mind. I would try and extrapolate that out to some kind of requirement myself, but just in terms of like, how can we possibly know anything about metaphysics if we don't make certain assumptions about our capacity as a human and as our mind, for our minds to know those things?
It's an interesting one. Should be a requirement. I mean, it seems like, so I see this like I'm essentially just agreeing again to the same thing I was agreeing to before, and just sort of elaborating a little bit on the thing I said about triviality. It's like, yeah, I agree with that, but what that amounts to for someone else could be something like saying, well, I mean, yeah, your mind at the end of the day is made of the same stuff as, and there might not be any more depth to it in terms of answering the requirement in that respect, right? Like, because I would conceive of a deeper commonality, this kind of reflective kind of, shining through, but I wouldn't expect someone else to share that. And so if we impose this requirement, then it could, like, I think if it is too influenced by what you think the world is like. That's why I don't really like it as a requirement. Because if you think that the world is, if you construe the nature of consciousness narrowly, then you can meet this requirement without actually doing the work that you and I would be thinking that requirement addresses. Does that make sense?
Can you give me an example?
Yeah. So like, if we say, okay, so it has to explain, what was it, the phenomenon of consciousness, or the phenomena, or the psyche,
like the workings of the psyche, like our internal experiences.
Yes. So you and I would think, okay, so there's archetypes, and then so one of the things we're expecting the theory then to do is to give us some sense of how the archetypes work, or where they come from, or what, whether they emerge just at one level, or, that kind of thing. But someone else could agree to that could say, my theory meets that criteria, but because they just don't believe in archetypes, there's missing content that we would be expecting to see when we impose the criteria, the requirement. So, right, because we have a conception of the world that includes some phenomena, we expect the theory, therefore, to explain that. They claim their theory meets the same requirement, but because they don't include it in their model of the world, archetypes, that is, that explanation's totally not there. So we would see that as you're not meeting that requirement. Do you see what I mean?
Yeah, I'd imagine that they're, by meeting other requirements that people will, for example, if we're going the other way from the grounds to the mind, or and saying it's self-similar, and we're saying like a requirement might be kind of like self-similar patterns that emerge, and they're complex and they emerge in different ways. We could call them archetypes, we could call them some other name, but that meeting that requirement would look like what we call archetypes, or how we frame the idea of archetypes, no matter how, even if you didn't use that word or that language. I'd imagine that if you're meeting the other requirements that we set out, not that we've got any hard list or anything right now.
That's the thing is, I would prefer the requirements to not to, as far as possible, refrain from mentioning specific contents of the world as pictures. So archetypes is a picture.
Yeah.
A picture I happen to agree with, but like, I think the requirements shouldn't be. So there's certain pictures that are so undeniable, like, for instance, complexity or consciousness, internality, right? These are pictures that are undeniable enough that the vagueness doesn't bother me. But archetypes, something I believe in, but not undeniable. Lots of people don't believe in.
Yeah, sure. But do you see what I mean by like archetypes is just kind of another word for kind of forms or something, or like
Sure, another word for, but people still don't believe in that concept is the thing.
So
So ancestral ideas or something, right?
Or just like common imagery throughout history, like common mythological themes or common like there's some level of undeniable facts in there, and like we're interpreting it in a particular way.
Yes,
as archetypes.
Sure, but you could. This is what I mean is so the insofar as there's a requirement to say explain the commonalities in the symbolism. Okay, so I just give an evolutionary kind of, well, we're all ultimately have the common ancestor, and so our, at some point in the history we diverge, but we have like these similarities, and these similarities play some role in structuring our symbolic representations, and there's a just so story that goes along with that where, so it's like the requirement means something different to different people because of the difference in the conception of the world.
But you've just given a meeting of that requirement, but in a materialistic sense, right? Like
Yes.
you've done a reductionist meeting of that requirement. But we could do a metaphysical meening of that requirement, or like a different ontological foundational meeting.
Well, no, but I guess what I'm saying is that on some views of metaphysics, that meaning of the requirement is all there is to say.
Okay.
Because depending on your picture of the world, if you think archetypes, I have a more expansive conception of archetypes than, that the thing that I articulated is part of my idea of archetypes, but it's something more than that, that has kind of more mystical connotations at the edges of the concept, basically,
Sure. I'm feeling like maybe we're missing each other a little bit.
Yeah, I think so.
In the discussion of it. So I think the description you just gave me of explaining why there are like common imagery, so, for example, in our psyches, and in our dreams and in our stories and our myths, as being, an evolutionary thing from our ancestry. That's one explanation that would meet the requirement of explaining that thing. Like that, could be explained in other ways. Whether that explanation you gave is satisfactory, that's just kind of one particular frame of it. I think that there could be other frames and explanations that also meet other requirements, such as self-similarity, that give a richer definition and possibilities within that explanation as well. And that's probably why I think that it's interesting to have a requirement in there. And again, it might be more general. It might not be like explains archetypes or explains, something specific that we've got more of a preference for. But I am curious if there's something in there to pull out that we can agree on.
Yeah, I mean, there seems to be something in the thought that, like, there's some common substance that the mind derives from with the universe, like that there's some common. I'm not expressing myself well. That they.
Well, it's kind of like what we said, that our minds are part of that fundamental stuff, right? It's not a separate thing. And the patterns that have created our mind is not separate from that thing. So there's a sense that the contents of our mind also might reflect that thing. And again, that kind of comes back to that's why we can even say anything about that thing.
Yeah, I think that's the bit I'm getting caught up on. Because I agree with what you're saying. on a personal level. But it occurs to me that some people don't believe this. So there are people out there who believe that the nature of the universe is not of a piece with the nature of our minds and the principles that structure our minds. Now, to me, that view is absurd, but there are people who hold that view.
But do we want to have, I guess, like, do we want to allow the criteria for, like, the standards, if we're setting standards here for requirements of a theory of everything, to allow for theories that are absurd? Like, do we want to allow that to be the case? Like, if we're going to be, like, really honest with ourselves.
The thing is, what it would mean to allow for a theory to be absurd would be not to impose the requirement that we're talking about. Because that's what this requirement in essence amounts to, is a commitment that I share. And then, but the thing I'm getting caught up on is when you say, well, this is required in order for us to have any coherent dialogue, which I agree with, which makes it seem like it should be a requirement. But then I'm like, okay, but there are people out there who imagine an absurd metaphysic and they're like on board with that. And so I'm kind of oscillating a bit on the issue.
I imagine that the people who are just taking that requirement and not doing the explanatory scope and their principle of sufficient reason, like the principle of sufficient reason being, number one, is like, what's the sufficient reason that
no, but what I guess what I mean though is, because would you prefer to include the possibility of an absurd metaphysics or exclude it, I suppose?
Well, I'm imagining that I would try and exclude it in the principle of sufficient reason. Like, that's where I would imagine those being excluded.
No.
The
because there's a thing we talked about before about decoupling, right? So the most general universe may well have a PSR, and there may be a sufficient reason why this universe exists. That doesn't guarantee that the nature of our mind is of a piece with the nature of the fundamental reality, because of the possibility of decoupling.
The decoupling being like the Descartes demon, and like there's absolutely no.
The line of scenarios that leads to a world.
But if we were to say that was allowed in our requirements of a toe, that scenario, then whoever believed that will be like, well, if there's a decoupling, how can you say anything about fundamental reality at all?
I agree with you about that.
Yeah.
About that, it seems like the decoupling like undermines everything, and so we might insist on the coupling part, but in order to have a coherent discussion about it.
Yeah. I mean, we kind of have to, right? Like, anyone who says like we can't know is sort of implying, no, they're not implying the decoupling, but they're suggesting some reason why we can't know. Like, our brains aren't. Yep. How could our brains fathom the absolute? Something like that. So I'm imagining that in our pursuit of even saying we can say there are requirements of a toe, or that there can even be a toe, we have to make that commitment in some way, saying that we can find that out. Like, we can take the steps on that journey to discover what fundamental reality is. Because if we don't start there, and we say, oh, but maybe we can't know. Well, I mean, we can say maybe we can't know, but I'm still going to try and see if we can. And maybe that's the place that you're wanting to kind of make sure we don't cut off from, like that. Because I feel like once we've stepped towards this sense that like that a theory of everything is possible and that we can define its requirements, once we've stepped into that domain, we kind of have to make some kind of commitment to, the fact that we could know in some way. And in order to do that, we might have to at least put aside or like cut out for another time, put in a box somewhere, this notion that, we have to leave open the things that stop us from knowing, or that's saying that we can't know, and or it sort of like kind of crumbles the whole operation in some way, right? Like, it's like undermines it all, like you said.
Okay. So I agree with what you're saying. And I agree that it makes sense to impose it as a requirement. So the way I would probably formulate the requirement is that intelligibility has to be given an explanation. That's how I would formulate the requirement, because that's really
Yeah.
what I see as the thing that's at issue. It's not so much of being made of the same stuff as the being made of the same stuff is a supposition that comes up in the attempt to make sense of the capacity for intelligibility, right? Like your mind makes sense of the world, and then you have to kind of figure out how to make sense of the fact that your mind came from the world and how it fits in and all of that. And yeah, so yes, I think that makes sense. So, and we might want to revisit then. There was an earlier one we talked about where this consideration of the decoupling was part of the discussion. Do you remember what that was?
I guess we're talking about the way that the things that are present in our reality, like general patterns that are kind of scale invariant, would be in some way the fundamental stuff. Like, but if there's that decoupling, then they're just, our universe and not anything deeper than that.
Okay, yeah. Okay. Maybe.
Maybe just need some more time to think about it.
I think we leave that one as it is, because fractality is one way of accounting for the intelligibility thing, but not the only way, I think.
Yeah, no, totally. And it's interesting because we have to consider that when any requirement that we come up with has to in some way be thought of or considered in relationship to the others. Sorry.
Yeah.
So like I could imagine that somebody could answer that intelligibility requirement with some obscure, I don't know, I'm not making it up on the spot, but but in meeting the other requirements, that would be seen as absurd or whatever.
Yeah.
Cool. Should we move on?
Yeah, let's do it.
There's a few more left. Okay, the next one is falsifiability. I think this one's interesting. Yeah. But it's interesting because if you think about a theory of everything and you're talking about the kind of the term aspects of it, the fundamental stuff, the necessary non-contingent ground of being, if it's falsifiable, it just seems like you've got it wrong. Like it's...
Yes, exactly. Precisely. Yeah.
Yeah, it's not... I mean, there could be better formulations of it, or like semantics that have a better way of explaining it, but
it really depends on how you construe falsifiability. If what we mean by falsifiability is like it's capable of open to being pointed out that there are flaws or some kind of logical errors, then of course we would want that. I think that it's just, I wouldn't call that falsifiability. I think falsifiability usually refers to an empirical idea, right? Like that you'll be able to do some experimental test to evaluate whether the predictions generated by the theory match the observed outcome. And I think you're right on the money when you say that the thing about that non-contingency, that ground, is that the idea of falsifying it kind of relies on the thought that there's going to be a way of isolating it and like kind of separating it from everything else. And the thing is that it's in everything. It's not separable. It's not possible to kind of say, okay, well, what would things look like if it weren't there? What would things look like if it was there? Like it's not amenable to that frame of inquiry.
Yeah, I see that as well. Like the falsifiability is very much a product of induction, and like, all swans are white. Oh wait, a black swan showed up. Now they're not all white. Then it's sort of truth content in a. It's more like facts. I like the idea that, or the framing of it is that facts are kind of things that can change, and then the truth is things that doesn't or has one particular framing, something like that. I don't know how helpful that is, but maybe
I would probably draw the distinction in the other way.
Right. Yeah,
because that's the thing is I have two. This is why I like the capitalization scheme. I have truth and truth. So Truth with a little t, that's propositional in nature, right? It refers to the set of things that we believe are correspond with the way things are, right? And that changes. Truth with a capital T, the way things are, doesn't change. And the facts, I would think, I see the facts as like the set of states of affairs that make up the way things are. So the facts, I don't see as changing either.
Fair enough. I guess there's like scientific facts tend to be seen as...
Yes. Scientific fact, I think, has a separate sense, which is a provisional truth. Yeah.
Anyway, let's move on. It seems like we're both in agreement that we wouldn't include them.
Yeah.
Okay, so my next one is explains life. And I guess we need to get into definitions here, like what makes something alive as opposed to dead.
Fuck, man. Who knows? My instinct is no. You shouldn't explain life. That seems a specific that is in the domain of the special sciences.
Seems like a puzzle that if it is against like bonus points if you get this one.
Exactly. That's how I would relate to it as well. Yeah.
So this next one is in the realm of mythos and spirituality, but explains the image of God. I say image of God as in like the sort of myth, or the idea or the kind of prevalent, cross-cultural element of deities and gods and things like that.
Yeah. It's the image of God. So I'm conflicted again. So I'm inclined to say no, but someone who thought that the ground was a deity would obviously expect this to be a requirement, right? Like, which I think is the usual conception of a deity. Sorry, my alarm's gone off. Yeah, I think the usual conception of a deity is as the ground of being. That's not my conception, but that is the usual one. And sorry.
No, I was just thinking that it's interesting that, I think one of the assumptions that we both have that we haven't talked about in terms of a requirement is that there is a ground of being, there is a non-contingent necessary ground of being.
If I feel like that one to me is a necessary presupposition of any metaphysics. Like the notion of a theory of everything doesn't make sense unless there's a ground, I think.
Right, but does that not automatically put kind of materialism and physicalism out of the window?
Yep.
It's interesting that, like, I'm obviously in agreement with you personally there, but it's interesting to think that immediately, like off the bat, we're both happy with that. Like we're both kind
ruling
of like
that out. Yeah, I think the whole idea of, and I go into this in the article I wrote, the matter with materialism. I go into this a bit, but I think the whole idea of materialism or physicalism as a metaphysics is a silly, confused notion. Like what the philosophical position amounts to is a denouncement of metaphysics, of the need for metaphysics. So, of course, we're ruling those out. That's not metaphysics. The position is just saying we don't need metaphysics. So yeah, we're going to rule those ones out.
That makes sense. Yeah, if we're defining a theory of everything to include a theory of unified metaphysics, and that position denies metaphysics, then we can't very well include it.
Yeah,
that makes sense. That's kind of the end of the list. I feel like I haven't been writing down anything to suggest that we've got a list ourselves, but this is sort of maybe the first of many conversations where we can start to
what I was thinking actually is we could do another one maybe next week or maybe the week after, since we're coming up on the release date. But with the same exact subject, but I'll plan more, and then next time I can lead.
Okay.
Because I can focus it around the list that I didn't, the derivation of specificity video didn't focus in on my list enough. I think that's one of the problems. It was like scattered and near the end. So I think that could potentially be
Cool.
You know,
Yeah.
I really loved this conversation. I thought it developed well, and the concepts came out really nice. And I think it would be cool to have like a parallel conversation where, I'm being more directive.
Cool. Yeah, no, I
Yeah.
wasn't expecting us to, come up with our finished list today either.
Yeah.
It's more just like we're just exploring these ideas as we go. But I think it's interesting because part of our channel, I guess, we've always had this intention of, getting closer to truth, and I think this project specifically can help guide us in that.
Definitely. Yeah. No, I definitely agree. And I especially liked the part of the conversation around where I ended up settling or landing on the intelligibility requirement, because that wasn't on my list. I've never thought of that before.
Yeah.
And it was nice to have that, to have a chance to update that set of requirements, because it's something I've thought about a lot. So it's a refreshing experience, to realize that, I've left something out. That's look at that.
Yeah, it was almost like a step that you were slightly reluctant to take in terms of just shelving the thing that stopped you from taking that step, even if it's just, temporarily, but just in order to like commit to the project in some way. Not
well, yeah, I think that it's not necessarily that, because on a personal level, there's no reluctance whatsoever. Okay. It's more that I wasn't sure whether I was imposing my personal philosophical prejudice on the requirements that I would expect other people to meet. And it just, because I think that particular subject, and especially because the way it was introduced, like I ended up settling on a different word, intelligibility. And the way it was introduced, I think it was just a bit of a gray area in terms of, but I think partly, I just hadn't thought through the idea that the decoupling can be excluded because it's a requirement in itself that for us to be able to do a project like this or come up with a list of requirements or something, right? That be false. I just hadn't gone through it, because I guess when I'm thinking of requirements, I'm trying to remain as open as possible with respect to what other people might think about the nature of the world.
Yeah. So that might even be, it's almost like we need the requirements of a theory of everything. Yeah. Which includes that the universe is intelligible in such a way that we can even partake in figuring out.
Well, that's kind of what I said in terms of like we have these two sets of requirements, and I'll have to think about which of the boxes the intelligibility requirement goes into, whether it's one of the pre-reflective presuppositions of reason itself, or which I think it is. Yeah, it does seem to be of that kind. But it also seems to be applicable in a more direct way to the TOEs, whereas some of the other ones that I put in that box seemed like too rigorous a test to impose almost.
Yeah, I like the catch-all kind of bonus puzzles category.
Yeah.
Which kind of...
I thought that was a really nice organic emergence out of, like, we've used the puzzle analogy before, but the way because we've used the puzzle analogy in the sense of the puzzle pieces, and the sense of solving puzzles actually comes from Kuhn's work. That's how he contextualizes science and the workings of science. But I really like the way, like, we were able to bracket some of those issues in terms of because we've talked before about what is inside and outside the boundaries of a TOE, and being able to bracket those in a consistent category of these are all puzzles that kind of get extra credit. I like that. That's very intuitive, and I thought that made a lot of sense. So.
Yeah, same. And we just keep coming back to this puzzle analogy. We just keep it going.
That's it.
Yeah. I mean, I feel good to end it there if you're happy. Yeah.
Yep.
Thanks again for the chat. Yeah, it's really fun and had a lot. Yeah.
I'm looking forward to the next one. I think maybe we can do a better job wrapping a bow around it. Like I thought we did a great job opening up the subject and the territory, and I think next time we'll be able to get a lot more zone in, a lot more in terms of coming to a more specific, definitive list for the listeners.
Totally. Yeah, man. Well, have a great day, and I'll see you in the next one.
You too, man. Have a good one.
See ya.